Russia wants the Donbass. That's hardly a secret, as it was the Donbass that was Vladimir Putin's target during his initial campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014, and it's the Donbass where we see much of the fighting taking place today. But in the summer, Ukraine's defenses were going to crumble. Pokrovsk would fall to Russia, the fortress belt in Donetsk would follow, and once Donetsk was occupied, the Donbass would finally be Russia's. That was the plan, but Ukraine had other ideas. The Donbass offensive was meant to break Ukraine, but it broke Russia instead, making the region Putin's worst nightmare. Putin had everything planned out in 2025. He organized the largest troop gathering seen in the Donbass up until this point during the war in Ukraine, with most of those soldiers being focused on Pokrovsk. With that gathering, Russia would make the key breakthrough that has been trying to make for years, taking down Pokrovsk and clearing the way to the remaining Donbass stronghold cities that would be the last to fall before the Donbass was finally occupied. A year of continuous offensive activity hasn't worked. Russia doesn't have a foothold in Pokrovsk. That city is the key to everything that Russia needs to achieve in the Donbass. Reuters explained why in a July 2025 article, in which it explained that many in Russia now call Pokrovsk the gateway to Donetsk. Beyond the city's coking coal industry and symbolic importance as one of Ukraine's sturdiest bastions of defense, Pokrovsk would provide Russia with a route toward the Donetsk fortress cities that it needs to take to claim the Donbass. Russia would also hope that the fall of Pokrovsk would weaken those other strongholds. Pokrovsk is a vital logistical ley line for Ukraine, with many of the supplies and soldiers it sends to the Donbass being routed through the city. Pokrovsk would give Russia options and control, which are two things Putin needs in the Donbass right now. This summer was supposed to be when Pokrovsk fell. Putin was going to make sure of that, amassing a seemingly overwhelming force of 110,000 soldiers near the city. That sheer mass of manpower would allow Russia to push through, to break down Ukraine's defenses no matter how much of a fight Ukraine put up. As the new Voice of Ukraine points out, the troop gathering Putin assembled was about twice the pre-war population of Pokrovsk, showcasing just how serious Russia was about taking the city. Viktor Treubov, who is the spokesperson for the Dnipro Operational Strategic Troop Grouping, tried to make sense of the situation in an August 23rd interview. If before the war, about 110,000 Russian soldiers operated in the Pokrovsk sector, I don't even know how to properly describe the scale, he said. Pokrovsk's pre-war population was 60,000, so Russia's military presence is effectively double. It feels like they gathered such a horde as if to take on an average European country. Russia's goal during the summer was to make Pokrovsk the hottest spot of Russia's wide offensive, and along the way Russia wanted to achieve some psychological victories. It eschewed its typical large mechanized assaults in favor of sending small units of soldiers into settlements around Pokrovsk. Part of this approach was part of a strategy to encircle Pokrovsk, allowing for a later assault from multiple angles. However, Russia wanted to capture evidence of its soldiers putting boots on new ground. Raise a flag, take a photo, and it doesn't matter if Ukraine pushes you out again. The image is there, the propaganda can spread. With an army large enough to take on a small, perhaps even a medium-sized European country, Putin was also convinced that Russia would be able to move on from the captured Pokrovsk and into the Donetsk fortress belt. That belt, which the Institute for the Study of War says runs for about 31 miles through western Donetsk, both includes and is protected by Pokrovsk. The belt roughly links the city of Slovyansk in the north to Konstantinivka, some 50 kilometers to the south. Take Pokrovsk by the end of August, break through the fortress belt in the months that followed as Ukraine's defenses faltered, finally claim the Donbass. The fly in the ointment of Putin's grand plan for the Donbass is already apparent now that the summer is over. Pokrovsk didn't fall. The city is still being fiercely defended by Ukraine's soldiers, and Russia has experienced massive losses trying to take it. As Euromaidan Press puts it, with Vladimir Putin putting all his chips on the table for this offensive, it's becoming this war's Stalingrad. For context, the Battle of Stalingrad, which the former Soviet Union contested against Nazi Germany during World War II, saw the Soviet Union experience 1.1 million military casualties, along with losing 40,000 of its civilians. While Euromaidan Press's claim is a little hyperbolic, its point still stands that an offensive that was supposed to signal the end of Ukraine's Donbass resistance has instead bled the Russian forces in that region dry. The Kyiv Independent has the numbers. Sharing data from the deep state open source intelligence group, it says that Russia managed to occupy about 1,548 square kilometers, or around 579 square miles, during the 3 months starting in June and ending in August. That seems like a solid result on the surface, especially when you consider that Russia took just 659 square kilometers or 254 square miles of the Donbass during the same period in 2024. However, as we've already noted, those gains didn't include the one city that Putin made Russia's goal to capture during the summer. And worse yet for Russia, these gains came at a terrible price. Russia's reliance on waves of small infantry groups, often sent one after another, into Ukrainian territory created a so-called meat grinder, from which many of Russia's soldiers failed to escape. In Donetsk alone, to which Russia has committed 110,000 soldiers for its summer offensive, the losses broke the back of Russia's summer campaign. Ukraine's general staff says that Russia lost 94,810 personnel to death, injury or capture in just 3 short months of the summer offensive. That amounts to more than 31,000 soldiers per month, or a daily casualty rate of 1,030. Of course, you may think that Russia can continue its assault on Pokrovsk into the winter, and you may have a point. On September 15th, Forbes says that Russia was preparing another push into Pokrovsk, which Putin still seems strangely confident will succeed and afford him the Donbass. When Putin met US President Donald Trump back in August, he reportedly told Trump that Russia intended to seize the Donbass within 2 to 3 months, maximum 4. That's an ambitious goal, even if Russia had managed to take Pokrovsk during the summer. The fact the city still stands means that Putin is either delusional or he's lying through his teeth to give Trump an inaccurate picture of how the fighting in the Donbass is really going. If we assume Putin genuinely believes the Donbass is on the verge of falling, he is committed to sending even more soldiers to the region for a fall and winter offensive. The commander of Ukraine's 225th Separate Assault Regiment, Major Ole Shryaev, claimed on September 18th that another 16,000 troops have been amassed in the Donbass, and a renewed offensive is coming in a matter of days. In the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians are trying to break through our defensive lines, the major says. As far as I can see, and this is my subjective opinion, the enemy will be gathering some more reserves there, and within the next maybe 10 days, they will begin a counteroffensive. So Russia isn't going to stop trying now that the summer has ended. However, you may have noticed that the maths doesn't quite add up. Russia committed 110,000 troops to Pokrovsk for the summer offensive, yet according to a Ukrainian general, 94,000 of those soldiers were killed or wounded. A new contingent of 16,000 soldiers doesn't quite make up for those losses, which suggests that whatever assaults against Pokrovsk and by extension the Donbass that Russia launches throughout the rest of 2025 will be weaker and less effective. Rob Lee thinks that will be the case. A senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Lee tells the Kyiv Independent, Russia prefers using dismounted infantry assaults. By the winter, the rate of advance will probably decrease again. The phrase dismounted infantry assaults is a polite way of saying that Russia is now trying to take the Donbass without armor, such as tanks and armored vehicles, which only feeds into the idea that whatever renewed push is made for Pokrovsk during the winter will fail. Pokrovsk has become a death trap for Russia. In the process, it's turned into Putin's worst nightmare. It's a nightmare from which Putin can't awaken because he has to keep pushing for the Donbass. That's why, even amidst such horrific losses, Putin is sending more soldiers toward Pokrovsk that he knows will inevitably be slaughtered by Ukraine's defenses. The Donbass is just too important for Putin from the strategic, symbolic, and perhaps most importantly, the monetary perspectives. We've touched on the strategic aspect already by making note of Donetsk being home to Ukraine's fortress belt. Punching through that belt and taking control of Donetsk delivers control of the Donbass. That's the case because Russia already controls almost all of Luhansk, which is the other oblast that makes up the Donbass region. With the Donbass under control and the fortress belt gone, Russia could theoretically make much faster progress through central Ukraine than we've seen at any point since the first few weeks of the invasion. Symbolically, we mentioned earlier that the Donbass, along with Crimea, was one of Russia's main focuses during its 2014 campaign of aggression. That's because Putin has always contended that the Donbass should still be part of Russia, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Al Jazeera notes that the Donbass is home to many Russian speakers, with the region also having become part of romanticized Soviet-era mythology in Russia. Occupying the Donbass isn't taking territory from Ukraine in Putin's mind, it's restoring what is rightfully Russia's. However, Putin's attempt to cast himself as some sort of hero to those Russian speakers in the Donbass is undermined pretty significantly by the fact that, as always seems to be the case, Russia's leader has an ulterior motive: minerals. Lots of minerals. Ukraine is loaded with valuable minerals to the point where those minerals have become leverage for the country as it attempts to negotiate security guarantees from the United States. The total value of these mineral reserves, Newsweek reported in February, is an absolutely mind-blowing $14.8 trillion. Putting aside the logistics of accessing all of that money, about 70% of Ukraine's minerals are concentrated in 3 regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, and Dnipropetrovsk. You may recognize the first 2 regions as the pair that we just told you form the Donbass, and thus, Putin's ulterior motive is revealed. Sure, strategy and symbolism are important to Russia, but both of those reasons pale in comparison to the cold, hard cash that can be extracted from the Donbass. That's why Putin isn't going to stop his push for Pokrovsk. It's why he's determined to control the Donbass, and it's why many thousands more of Russia's soldiers, on top of the 94,000 plus who died during the summer, will be sacrificed at the altar of the territory. The obvious question Russia is now asking itself is, how did it fail? With so many troops, enough to take on a small European country no less, Pokrovsk should have fallen, leaving the Donbass primed for the taking. The answer to this question lies in a city that was considered among the most pivotal in the war, Avdiivka. It's fair to say that Avdiivka represents one of Ukraine's most devastating failures during the Ukraine war so far. Another fortress city, Avdiivka fell to Russia's forces in February 2024, granting Russia a settlement that sits on high terrain overlooking the rest of Donetsk. Ukraine made mistakes in its defense of Avdiivka, though it still inflicted massive casualties on Russia, which Euromaidan press places somewhere in the region of 25 to 40,000. Ukraine failed to fortify the defensive lines behind the fallen city sufficiently to prevent a further incursion into the Donbass. The Long War Journal puts it best when it says, "During the months-long battle for Avdiivka, Ukraine failed to construct a solid second line of defense behind the city. This left Ukrainian troops in a tough spot once Avdiivka fell, forcing them to dig in and lay mines amid active fighting." Ukraine's defenses were panicked during the battle for Avdiivka. Though the city itself was well fortified to the point where Russia likely lost more soldiers in its capture than it did during the entire decades-long Soviet-Afghan war, there was no backup, no second line of defense through which Ukraine could prevent a Russian advance or launch a counterattack. Ukraine instead invited Russia to attack Avdiivka and was essentially forced to abandon ship once the city fell. Harsh lessons were learned during that battle. These lessons have been taken into Ukraine's defense of Pokrovsk and the rest of the Donbass. As Russia moved forward, capturing small settlements and villages en route to Pokrovsk, Ukraine started to put the lessons that it had learned into action. It began mass-producing drones, Euromaidan press says, which have gone on to serve as a first line of defense for Pokrovsk even before Russia's troops reached the city itself. Those drones now patrol roads, highways, and any other potential route into the city. They also make up for Ukraine's artillery shortfall. And if Pokrovsk does fall, those drones will prove themselves a highly mobile defensive line as Ukraine's soldiers withdraw to the other fortress cities in the Donbass. Ukraine also moved from operating on a purely defensive basis to combining defense with offense during its defense of Pokrovsk, which we've seen throughout 2025. Kyiv was able to reorganize its defense and conduct localized counterattacks from late February to early March 2025, as the settlement of Kotlina was liberated, which pushed back a potential Russian salient, Euromaidan press says. The counterattacking aspect of Ukraine's new strategy also saw it bring in the Azov Brigade to counter Russia's new approach of using smaller units instead of large, mechanized assaults. When the Azov Brigade arrived in Pokrovsk in mid-August, Euromaidan press said that the clock was ticking on its chances to reverse gains around the city that Russia had made. Within days, news of recaptured settlements started pouring in as the Azov Brigade, coordinating with Pokrovsk's other defenders, shattered Russia's encirclement strategy. Within 48 hours of its arrival, that brigade and the counterattacks that it organized managed to wipe out 151 Russian soldiers while capturing 70 more, all as it reclaimed settlements from which Russia hoped to launch the concerted assault on Pokrovsk that might have delivered summer success to Putin. But perhaps the most important lesson Ukraine learned from Avdiivka is that you have to plan for the future. Pokrovsk may fall, but if it does, Ukraine can't give Russia free rein to take the rest of the Donbass, and it won't, as American author Ryan J. Haidt explains on his website. In anticipation of a broader collapse in Donbass, Ukraine has constructed a massive new line of fortifications across the rear areas of Donetsk Oblast, known officially as the Ukrainian Surovikin Line. This network of defenses spans more than 350 kilometers, from Drozhkivka to Sloviansk and beyond, Haidt says. In other words, Russia won't be met with withdrawing Ukrainian soldiers desperately laying mines if it ever does manage to capture Pokrovsk. This isn't going to be a repeat of Avdiivka. If Pokrovsk falls, more defenses await. The fortress belt is ready, as is the new Surovikin Line. Add Ukraine's ever-growing army of drones into the mix, and you get a death trap lying in wait behind the meat grinder that Pokrovsk has already become for Russia. Around 94,000 soldiers lost in Donbass region during the summer could end up being a fraction of what Russia has to sacrifice if it's ever going to take the Donbass by force. So where does all of this leave Russia's Donbass offensive? It certainly hasn't stopped, though it's likely that the rate of advance will slow down drastically as we enter winter and the Ukrainian terrain becomes a nightmare for Russia's forces to navigate. Pokrovsk still stands too, which means Russia's dwindling forces have to maintain their focus on a city that has already cost Putin tens of thousands of soldiers during the summer. And even if Russia manages to break Pokrovsk before Pokrovsk breaks it, the Donetsk fortress belt and the second line of defense born from the mistakes learned from Avdiivka await. Russia now faces a situation where it's trying to take the Donbass at a time when doing so would require more manpower than the country can spare. The UK's Ministry of Defence made that clear in mid-August, per the Washington Times. It estimates that Russia will need another 4 years and will have to lose another 2 million soldiers if it's going to gain full control over the Donbass region. Bear in mind that those 2 million add to the over 1 million troops that Russia has already lost since it launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Think back to the time frame Putin gave Trump. 4 months maximum back in August would charitably mean that Putin either believes or wants the US to believe that the Donbass will fall by the end of 2025. That simply isn't going to happen, the UK's Ministry of Defence says. It's going to take at least until August 2029, and that assumes that Russia's manpower and equipment issues don't weaken its assaults to the point where years more are added. Russia won't be able to sustain its assault on the Donbass for 4 years before the offensive breaks the country's back. And regardless of what he might say in public, Putin knows it too. Why do you think that he has made Ukraine ceding the Donbass the single most important request Russia is making as part of peace negotiations? Putin knows that Russia can't occupy the region without suffering horrific attrition, to the point where it devastates itself. So Putin wants to get the Donbass by the pen because the sword isn't working. Ukraine proved one thing during its summer defense of Pokrovsk. It won't give up the Donbass, no matter what Putin says. And that leaves Russia's leader in a no-win situation, where the one part of Ukraine that he wants the most is also the part that will cost Russia more than it ever anticipated. The great irony in all this is that Russia is trying to claim that it's achieved some kind of victory in Pokrovsk. At one point during the summer, it was almost on the verge of that victory being legitimate. But that supposed victory, like the offensive in the Donbass as a whole, has turned into a nightmare for Putin. Find out more in our video. And remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest situation in the Donbass. And thank you, as always, for watching.